The Warlord Vrex demanded her weapon. He expected a plasma rifle, a kinetic gauntlet, something lethal. Instead, Ambassador Alara Vance placed a single olive pit into his claw. He laughed, tossing it to the jungle soil. In a breath, it cracked. Roots exploded outward, a trunk thicker than a battle tank pillared toward the sky, and pale blossoms released a shimmering golden pollen. His war machine seized. His shock troops collapsed. The invasion ended without a single shot fired. Humanity's deadliest weapon wasn't firepower. It was a seed, patient and unstoppable. Ambassador Alara Vance was a xenobotanist, stationed on the contested jungle world of Karthus. When the Keth Dominion came to conquer, her outpost had no army, only a single classified seed. That seed was the product of Earth's most guarded defensive program, designed not to destroy, but to reclaim. The galaxy would soon learn that humanity's patience is far more terrifying than its firepower. The Keth Dominion had conquered 17 star systems before they ever set their claws on Karthus. They were apex predators, towering reptilians with scales that could deflect small arms fire, wielding plasma technology reverse-engineered from a dozen defeated species. Warlord Vrex himself had personally shattered the defensive fleets of the Taurian Alliance, the Zelari Conclave, and the free colonies of Rigel 7. He had never lost a ground engagement. So when his war barge descended through the mist-shrouded canopy, and his shock troops encircled the pathetic human compound, a few prefab structures and a terraforming research station, Vrex expected immediate groveling surrender. He found instead a single woman standing in the mud, wearing a standard-issue science tunic, her hands empty. Alara Vance. The humans had been warned. The Coalition Council had abandoned Karthus 3 months prior, deeming the remote jungle world indefensible. They evacuated all military personnel, all heavy equipment, leaving behind only a skeleton crew of researchers to gather final soil samples before the inevitable Dominion annexation. Alara wasn't a soldier. She was a xenobotanist, a specialist in adaptive agriculture from the University of New Nairobi, assigned to Karthus to study indigenous plant life for potential pharmaceutical applications. She had never fired a weapon in her life. But she carried something far more valuable than a rifle. She carried a single olive pit, sealed in a cryogenic vial, genetically encoded with the entirety of Earth's most radical defense initiative, the Gaia Protocol. The program had been deemed too dangerous for deployment, too unpredictable for conventional warfare. It was, in the words of its architect Dr. Anya Sharma, not a weapon of destruction, but a weapon of creation. And creation, when unleashed without limit, can be the most devastating force in the universe. Vrex's translator crackled as he stepped forward, his armored claw extended. He demanded her weapon, a traditional Keth gesture of dominance, forcing a defeated enemy to physically hand over their instrument of defiance. His troops hissed with anticipation, expecting a plasma rifle, a kinetic gauntlet, some gleaming piece of human engineering they could add to their trophy vaults. When Alara pressed the tiny olive pit into his palm, Vrex stared at it with genuine confusion. The thing was rough, brown, faintly oily, utterly unremarkable. He tilted his massive head and emitted a barking laugh that his soldiers dutifully echoed, a chorus of derision that rang through the jungle. He tossed the pit aside like garbage. It landed in a patch of exposed soil at the edge of the courtyard, sank slightly into the wet earth, and began to drink. No one noticed. No one was looking at the ground. They were all watching the human ambassador, waiting for her to show fear. She showed none, because she understood what was about to happen. The seed's genetic triggers had been calibrated to detect alien electromagnetic signatures, the very energy fields emitted by Dominion armor and weaponry. The moment Vrex's fleet had entered orbit, the seed had known exactly when to activate. The countdown had already begun. And now, in the humid silence of that jungle courtyard, with an entire invasion force arrayed before her, Alara Vance simply closed her eyes and waited for the impossible to erupt from the ground beneath their feet. What happened next defied every law of biology the Keth Dominion understood. The olive pit, discarded and forgotten in the damp soil, did not simply germinate. It detonated. A sound like tearing fabric split the air as the seed's outer shell cracked with a sharp, crystalline snap. Then the roots came, not the slow, creeping tendrils of a terrestrial plant, but explosive, serpentine cables of fibrous matter that punched through the earth in a radial web. They spread across the courtyard in a blink, slamming into the armored boots of the shocked troops and anchoring themselves with the force of hydraulic rams. Before Vrex could even process what he was seeing, the trunk erupted skyward. It was a column of dense, gray-brown biomass, spiraling upward like a corkscrew, thickening with every rotation until it was wider than a battle tank. The ground heaved, cracking the prefab foundations as the tree's mass pushed 50, then 100, then 200 feet into the misty canopy. The sound it made was a groaning scream, the shriek of ancient wood under impossible tension, a noise that vibrated in the chests of every soldier present. Branches unfurled like the arms of a waking giant, each limb thick as a dropship strut, reaching out over the paralyzed invasion force. Warlord Vrex stumbled backward, his translator emitting a string of guttural curses. He drew his plasma sidearm and fired directly into the trunk. The green bolt splashed harmlessly against the bark, which had thickened into a carbon composite armor harder than starship hull plating. Before he could fire again, a pale blossom the size of a command pod bloomed directly above his head. It opened with a soft, wet exhale, releasing a cloud of shimmering golden pollen that drifted downward like a slow-motion aurora. Vrex raised his arm to shield his face, but the particles were too small to block. They seeped into every crevice between armor plates, into barrel housings, through filtration vents, and then they began to work. The Gaia Protocol had been engineered at the molecular level, a convergence of synthetic biology and old Earth agricultural wisdom. Dr. Anya Sharma, the project's lead architect, had drawn inspiration from the olive tree's legendary resilience, splicing its genome with targeted nanophage sequences and rapid-growth proteins derived from deep-sea extremophiles. The pollen grains were not simple plant matter. They were microscopic delivery vectors, programmed to seek out specific energy signatures. Dominion plasma coils operated on a high-frequency cycling pattern that the grains recognized instantly. Upon contact, the pollen exuded a resinous, conductive paste that bridged circuits and fouled capacitor banks. Every plasma rifle in the courtyard began to sputter and smoke. The war machines, 10-meter-tall walkers bristling with heavy cannons, groaned to a halt as their firing mechanisms seized, their joints locking rigid. The operators inside hammered at their controls, but the systems were already dead, coated in a layer of organic insulation that hardened into a ceramic-like shell within seconds. The Keth soldiers fared no better. Their reactive plating, designed to deflect kinetic projectiles, relied on a network of microsensors that read incoming threat vectors and adjusted shield frequencies accordingly. The golden pollen infiltrated those sensors, triggering a cascading false positive loop. Each grain registered as a separate, simultaneous impact. The armor systems, overwhelmed by contradictory data, defaulted to their emergency lockdown protocol. Plates clamped down, joints seized, and the proud shocked troops of the Dominion found themselves frozen in place, encased in their own unyielding shells. Even their breathing became labored as filtration membranes gummed up with the sticky residue. The courtyard, moments ago a staging ground for conquest, became a silent garden of statues. Vrex alone remained partially mobile. His command-grade armor had higher-tier shielding, but the pollen was relentless. Warning glyphs flashed across his visor as subsystem after subsystem winked out. He staggered, dropping to one knee, his massive claw still clutching the useless plasma pistol. He looked up at the tree, then at Alara Vance, who stood exactly where she had been, untouched by the chaos. The pollen swirled around her but did not stick, repelled by a counter-frequency embedded in her science tunic, a detail the Keth warlord could not possibly have anticipated. But here is the thing about the Gaia Protocol that makes it truly terrifying. The tree was only the first stage. The pollen was never meant to be a localized effect. As the blossoms continued to open, the golden cloud expanded outward, riding the natural thermal currents of the jungle. It drifted beyond the compound perimeter, toward the Keth landing zone where a dozen troop transports and a heavy artillery battery sat parked. In minutes, the entire mechanized force was neutralized, their engines choked, their pilots trapped. The pollen did not stop there. It rose higher, pushed by the planet's atmospheric circulation, heading toward the upper troposphere where the Dominion War barge hung in low orbit, its scanning arrays trained on the surface. The barge's sensors began to flicker as the first particles made contact with the hull, attracted by the ship's massive power core. The crew had no idea what was happening. They only saw their groundside forces go dark, one unit at a time. Ambassador Vance stepped forward, the roots of the great tree coiling gently around her path but never touching her. She looked at Warlord Vrex, pinned and helpless, his legendary conquest reduced to a tableau of paralyzed warriors. "You asked for my weapon," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden, unnatural silence. "This is what patience looks like. It grows, and when it grows, it reclaims everything." Vrex stared at her, his species' instinctive terror of entrapment overridden by a dawning, humiliating understanding. He had not been defeated by firepower or superior tactics. He had been undone by a seed. And now, the entire Dominion expeditionary force was hostage to a single, unstoppable bloom. The war barge still had its main batteries. They could glass the compound from orbit, erase this insult with brute force. But Alara knew, and Vrex was beginning to suspect, that any orbital strike would only scatter the pollen higher, wider, faster, turning a localized defense into a planetary contagion. The real question was no longer who would win this battle. It was whether anyone would survive it. Inside the crippled war barge, panic was spreading faster than the pollen itself. Sub-Commander Krell, Vrex's second-in-command, stared at the tactical holo display in disbelief. Groundside telemetry showed every single shock trooper locked in armor stasis. The walkers were silent, the artillery pieces offline. And now, as the golden cloud expanded into the upper atmosphere, the barge's own sensor grid began displaying erratic phantom contacts. Every one of those ghosts was a grain of pollen, reflecting the barge's own LiDAR signatures back at itself, creating a feedback loop that blinded their targeting systems. Krell activated the ship-wide comms, his voice tight. "All stations, seal external intakes. Initiate Biohazard Protocol 7. It was already too late. The ship's ventral heat venting scoops, designed to dissipate plasma exhaust, had passively ingested millions of particles. Within minutes, the primary reactor's cooling manifolds began to clog with a hardening organic slurry. Temperature alarms wailed. Vrex, still frozen on the ground, received Krell's transmission through his helmet's emergency channel. "Warlord, the barge is compromised. Our orbit is decaying. If we lose main power, we will crash." Vrex tried to speak, but the armor's jaw servos were locked. He could only listen as his empire's most advanced warship drifted helplessly toward the gravitational pull of the planet it had come to conquer. The tree, now over 300 feet tall, had become a spire visible for miles. Its canopy pulsed with a deep, rhythmic hum, as if the entire organism was breathing. And it was. The roots had tapped into the geothermal vents beneath the outpost, drawing up mineral-rich steam and expelling a fine mist of water vapor laced with spores. The mist rose, forming a mushrooming column that fed the upper atmospheric pollen layer. This was not a static defense. It was a terraforming engine, and it was reprogramming the atmosphere of Carthus in real time. The Keth had no framework for this. Their entire military doctrine was built around overwhelming force, the shock of dominance, the certainty that technology could be studied and countered. But this was not technology in any sense they understood. It was biology weaponized not through destruction, but through creation. On the barge, the science officer, a gaunt Keth named Drow, finally identified the pollen's composition, a hybrid prion-protein structure that self-assembled upon contact with specific electromagnetic frequencies. It was, in his terrified words, a self-replicating contagion that feeds on energy signatures. The more the Keth resisted, the more substrate they provided for the pollen to clone itself. Every active plasma coil, every shield generator, every powered system was a feeding ground. The only safe state was to power down completely, but powering down meant surrender. Warlord Vrex, a conqueror of 17 systems, now stood pinned by a plant. The humiliation was absolute, but worse than humiliation was the dawning realization that his tactical doctrine had failed at a fundamental level. He had prepared for war, and the humans had answered with life itself. Their weapon did not kill. It simply made killing impossible. It removed the capacity for violence. And now, as the first reports came in from the barge's long-range scanners, a new horror emerged. The spores had reached the upper jet stream and were dispersing across the continent. Within hours, secondary growths were sprouting in the distant valleys, pushing up through the jungle canopy. The Gaia Protocol was not a single tree. It was a planetary transformation sequence, and it had been triggered by the very invasion force meant to crush it. Vrex's own soldiers, their armor still locked, were now merely components of an ecosystem reclaiming a world. Krell's voice returned, ragged with desperation. Warlord, the orbital defense grid on the surface. Its were detecting multiple pollen clusters converging on the missile silos. If they reached the warheads, a detonation could scatter the contagion across the entire solar system. The trap was perfect. Vrex understood now. The humans had lured him into a battlefield where every act of aggression only accelerated his own defeat. The hardened roots, the armored bark, the pollen, they were all part of a closed loop of escalation that fed on enemy action. The more you fought, the stronger it grew. The only move that did not lead to annihilation was to do nothing at all. And in the silence of that frozen courtyard, with his army turned to statues and his warship falling out of the sky, Vrex made the hardest decision of his life. He used the one manual override still functioning, his external speaker grill, and with a voice stripped of all pride, rasped a single word that would echo through Dominion history. But that word and the astonishing negotiation that followed would change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. The word was yield. Warlord Vrex, conqueror of 17 systems, breaker of fleets, knelt in the shadow of a tree he had dismissed as worthless chaff and surrendered his entire expeditionary force to a single unarmed human scientist. His external speaker crackled the syllable across all Dominion frequencies, reaching the crippled war barge and every paralyzed trooper in the compound. For a long, breathless moment, the jungle held its silence. Then Ambassador Vance raised her hand, palm outward, and the great tree responded, its branches stilled. The golden pollen ceased its relentless multiplication, hanging suspended in the air like a frozen sunset. She had not prayed. She had not spoken a command. The Gaia organism, genetically encoded to recognize human biosignatures at the command level, had been waiting for her assent to de-escalate. It was not a mindless weapon. It was a guardian bred for discernment, and it knew the difference between a defeated enemy and a threat requiring annihilation. The terms were simple and non-negotiable. Vrex would order the immediate power down of all Dominion assets in the system. The war barge, now barely maintaining altitude, would execute a controlled descent into the uninhabited northern wastes under human supervision. Every soldier would be disarmed, their armor manually unlocked by Terran biodecontamination teams once the pollen was neutralized. And critically, Vrex himself would transmit a formal statement to the Keth High Dominion Council, witnessed by coalition observers, acknowledging the failure of military force against Terran biological defenses and recommending a full cessation of hostilities. In exchange, no Keth would be harmed. The pollen would not advance beyond the Karthus atmosphere. The soldiers would be repatriated. It was not conquest. It was not even punishment. It was pure, surgical leverage, and Vrex had no countermove. He accepted. The war barge landed in a screeching, sparking heap on the northern tundra, its engines permanently fused. Across the compound, the tree slowly retracted its root network into a tight, subterranean coil, freeing the trapped soldiers but leaving their armor inert. They emerged blinking into the humid light, their scales coated in a fine golden dust that would slew off harmlessly within hours. Not a single life had been lost. Not a single shot fired by the human defenders. The Keth Dominion's most feared warlord had been neutralized by olive pollen and patience. Within 48 hours, the High Council received Vrex's transmission and the video evidence of the tree's emergence. The footage showed a towering biological monolith that had grown from seed to skyscraping maturity in 37 seconds. The Council's military analysts replayed it hundreds of times, searching for a technological trick, a conventional explosive, anything they could categorize. They found nothing but biology, and that terrified them more than any plasma cannon ever could. The coalition, for its part, responded with quiet, deliberate calm. They had not authorized the Gaia Protocol's deployment. It had been Alara Vance's decision alone, made in a moment of existential threat with the full knowledge that activating a planetary terraformer as a defensive weapon violated at least 6 interstellar conventions. But it had worked, and the galaxy had witnessed it. Within a week, 17 neutral systems requested Gaia Protocol saplings for their own defense. The Keth High Council, facing internal revolt from subordinate species emboldened by the Dominion's humiliation, sued for a formal armistice. For the first time in human galactic history, peace was not being negotiated from a position of military parity. It was being demanded from a position of absolute, unstoppable advantage. But the surprising truth, the detail that would shift everything, emerged only later. The Karthus tree was not unique. It was a prototype. And the same genetic seed stock had already been planted on 23 other contested worlds, dormant, waiting for the electromagnetic signature of invasion to trigger their waking. Humanity had not just won a battle. They had quietly, patiently, seeded the galaxy with sleeping guardians, and the Dominion had just announced to the universe exactly what would happen if anyone ever tried to conquer a human world again. The galaxy had spent centuries fearing humanity's warships, their kinetic bombardments, their stubborn refusal to stay defeated. But the truth, now undeniable, was far more unsettling. Earth had never needed superior firepower. It had simply learned to weaponize patience, the slow, inexorable logic of a seed that waits for the right moment to grow. Warlord Vrex's defeat wasn't an anomaly. It was a message, delivered not through threats but through a quiet, blooming certainty. Every world humanity touches carries the potential to become an unbreachable sanctuary. And the Dominion's invasion had just activated that potential across 23 contested systems. The question is no longer how humanity will survive in a hostile galaxy. It is how the galaxy will adapt to a species that has made peace as unstoppable as war. If this story of quiet defiance and biological brilliance kept you thinking, please like this video and subscribe for more tales from the edge of human ingenuity. Share it with someone who believes the best defense isn't a sword, it's a seed. Thanks for watching, and remember, what grows in silence can shake the stars.